You are listening to InspireMusicMediaRadio.com. One of my in-studio guests I have with me today is Grammy-nominated Mark Williams. He's a mixing engineer who has worked with many in the gospel music industry, also blues, all types of music. Mark Williams is a known, respected individual in the industry. I'm excited to have him here today. How are you doing, Mark Williams?
I'm doing good. I'm blushing after this introduction, but no, I'm doing great.
That's good, man. There's a couple of things that I want to talk to you about today, and I know the listeners want to hear.
Okay.
Mainly about the industry as a professional. There's a lot of engineers out there who really want to kind of get into the business and kind of know some morals and ways of doing things the right way. And I know you're the right man to talk about these things. So first thing is, can you just give me a little history about yourself in the industry?
Well, I grew up in a family of artists, meaning like painters, and my folks had moved from fine art into commercial art and advertising just to make a better living. And my dad had an agency in Chicago where I grew up, and through his work, I got to meet and be around some people in studios. That was in the middle 1960s. And I doubt many of your listeners have records or anything that are that old, but back in the 60s, records didn't have credits on them.
Wow.
They didn't, if they credited anybody besides the artist, they would credit the producer, and not always that. They'd never credit any of the staff or players or anything. So a lot of people didn't know there was such a thing as a recording industry.
Wow.
And the business as a whole was generally pretty small. You know, in the 50s going into the 60s, a lot of recordings, especially famous recordings here in the Southeast, were actually made in radio stations just because they actually had simple mixers and tape recorders and could actually make a recording. There wasn't really an industry there. Otherwise, you went to the major centers like New York and Nashville and L.A. and to a lesser extent Chicago, and worked in a recording studio that was owned by a label. So it was sort of in that thing. My dad was boating buddies with Bruce Swedeen, so I got to meet Bruce back in the 60s. Bruce, of course, went on to record all the Michael Jackson albums and everything like that. So, but at the time he was just a family friend and working in the recording industry in Chicago. So at least as a teenager, I got to learn that there was such a thing as a recording business and was really, really intrigued with it. Even though at the time I still wanted to pursue a career in art. But in college, I kind of fell out of the art and fell into music business, and at 19 quit college and began to record acoustic musicians. We call them folkies back then, in nightclubs around Chicago. I had my own old gear from the 1950s I dragged around in my old Chevrolet and record people live, and I began to do things in the studios and opened a studio with some guys. But it's a tough time in Chicago. Chicago was sort of moving from being sort of a cool place to make records that it was in the 1960s into becoming sort of jingle world where people just did advertising music. And when the studio I was involved in sort of came unglued, I decided to bail out and move elsewhere and ended up in Atlanta. And it was the middle of the disco era, so there wasn't much studio work because there weren't many bands playing. Wasn't much live music going on. Well, just records, you know. So I recorded classical music and sold big sound systems into nightclubs, and got a job offer to move to Charlotte to actually rep sound equipment. Moved here, hated repping sound equipment, and a couple of months later quit that and got into studios. And in the Carolinas, I found this amazing wealth of music. It still amazes me to this day. It's like musicians growing up out of the ground everywhere. Yes. And the best part is that here in this area, musicians, whether they believe it or not, actually get a lot more respect than they do in many other areas of the country, including where I came from in Chicago. So anyway, I settled in here and began recording just about everything I could get in front of a microphone, and still do it.
So I'm not going to say back then. I don't want to insult you. So I would say when you were carrying your equipment around, What was your mic at that time? What was the mic of choice? Or what was your gear? Can you tell me the little pieces of your?
I would have to name brand names that are lost to history. It was professional gear from the 1950s. Brand names like Berlant Concertone tape recorders, excuse me, Grome's mixers, and B&O ribbon microphones. I mean, it's just like, that's a long time ago. But again, the question about equipment is always asked to me. I have a friend in the region here who was starting some kind of a thing, and he was desperate to know what kind of mic preamp to buy. Mm-hmm. And excuse me, I'm getting over a bug here. And I just thought that's so out of context. I mean, it's really not about what mic preamp. It's really not about the equipment. It's about what you do with it. Yes. And what you do with it is based on your concept of what you're trying to get done. So, I could rattle off all the brand names and model numbers of my equipment, and everybody's welcome to know what it is, but it's really what I do with it. It's not the brand of hammer, it's the guy who swings it.
That's right.
And so what I asked the guy was, I can talk to you about preamps, but what have you done about acoustics? And he said, well, I was going to get some of those, square things you buy in the mail, or blocks of foam or whatever, and stick them up. And I said, well, you got to do more than that. Because, everything you do in the studio is based on what you hear.
Yes.
So you have to be absolutely sure that your first concentration is in creating an environment acoustically that doesn't contribute problems to what you hear. And it's at least equally important to have a recording space that also does not have problems. It may have different sorts of character in it, which means it doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be, totally dead or anything like that. In fact, it's better if it isn't. But it should not have funny resonances, and it shouldn't have funny issues, because that will flavor your perception of what you're doing.
Yes.
I'm not going to go through the long litany of my personal history, but I was freelance and traveling around this half of the country for a dozen years when I left Reflection. So up through the 2000s, pretty much. Then when the economy fell over sideways and my clients suddenly didn't have the budget to rent places like Ocean Way in Nashville for me to work in, I started mixing in a little space here in Charlotte that I'd rented to store my equipment. And to my surprise and delight, within about 6 months, I had all my old clients back. They all wanted to work with me. They just didn't have the budget to rent big studios.
Yes.
And they were happy with what I was doing in there, but I wasn't. They said they were happy, but I could tell a big difference between what I'd been doing in these major rooms and what I was getting out of there. So looking on this thing of having my own little mix room as my new chapter, my wife and I incorporated a little company, and I dropped a lot more money than I expected, building a small mix room that uses a top designer and a top company to, do the turnkey creation of the room. And that's the best thing I could have done, because the listening environment in here is absolutely first class, and I truly know what I'm doing. And that can't be stressed as being the most important piece of equipment in the room. It's just the acoustics. We can talk about preamps all day long, but if you can't hear what you're doing, what are you going to do with it?
Right. So nowadays, it's 2014. So I know it's really important as far as the room, the sound that you're getting. What would you suggest to people? Because I know most of your mixes that you're probably getting now are not done in big studios. So you have a lot of people.
No, the majority are not. That whole era seems to be gone, sadly, for me anyway. So, a lot of times I get projects in where there are consistent problems, sonic problems throughout the project. For instance, on vocals, I can pretty quickly find the resonant frequencies of the room in which they were recorded. That's an acoustic problem. And there are no really painless ways of getting rid of that. I mean, I can sort of notch things out, and I can do things like that, but it isn't kind to the sound of things when I do that. So the best thing is for people to, try to go to school and possibly hire somebody who actually knows what they're doing to help the acoustics of the space they work in. That doesn't have to be vastly expensive. The designer that I work with on this room who worked with me through Clarity Incorporated. They're the guys that did the turnkey on the room. But the designer is Jeff Headback. He's out of Indianapolis, and he basically sells a design.
Oh, wow.
And you can work with him to get the design and then do your own build on it if you want. He will work oftentimes through Clarity, and they'll show up and they'll shoot the room with lasers and get careful measurements and photos, descriptions, all the rest of it. And then Jeff will plug it into his things and come up with designs that will correct your issues and be cost effective. And then, if you want, have your own guys build it. And so it doesn't have to be vastly expensive. It just has to be good. And again, it's not so much the brand of stuff you buy as the way you use it. And one way to use it is to use it in a place where you can hear.
So as an engineer, you when you listen to a project, when it comes in, you can pretty much tell, and you can overcompensate. I know as far as your ears, they're tuned perfect as far as you being in the industry for. Well, I mean, I'm just saying
Well, think about it for a second. I mean, if you're a musician, you begin to understand and hear harmonic nuance. You begin to hear time. You begin to hear these things. If you're going to be involved in recording and especially mixing, you absolutely have to learn to listen.
Right.
And and that's why I say if you're going to talk about making a project, the very first thing you've got to do is to be able to completely envision the project that you want to end up with. I mean, top to bottom, inside and out. You've got to create in your mind, how's the sound field going to be? Where is the singer? What's this room? Even if it's a fantastic room that doesn't really exist anywhere, what is the space in which this is all taking place? And how's the arrangement? So you've got to have that sort of sense of vision. I mean, you've got to have a song. Song has to have something to say, and there's not much reason to have it otherwise. You've got to have a singer who can deliver that song so compellingly that your listener has to listen to the content. Hello, I'm sorry, I must have bumped my phone. You have to have a singer who can deliver that song so compellingly that that a listener has to dig in and understand the song.
Right.
And then you've got to have an arrangement that supports those two and never, ever interferes with them. So those are the three elements there. But sonically, you've got to have all those elements in place and think about where in space did this sort of fantastic thing take place. Even if you're creating the space, even if you're overdubbing everything, even if you've got different people doing it in different places. So anyway, you've got to have the concept really focused like that, because as a producer and arranger and everything, you can't just sort of turn things over to people. You can't hear about a fantastic bass player in Atlanta and send him a tape and hope he does something cool. You can't hear about this fabulous other guy somewhere and send him a thing to play to and hope he does something swell. You've really got to communicate what you need specifically, and you only will know this if you've already thought it up. So what happens a lot of times nowadays in gospel productions that I get is they're done piecemeal, which is just how you have to do it sometimes. But they're not very centrally controlled. Somebody sent I hate to say it, but an MP3 to somebody in New Jersey who plays great bass. Well, the bass guy, he wants to do good, so he's going to start, and all he hears is whatever you sent him. He doesn't really know what's really going to eventually be there, so he's going to probably play every hot lick he ever heard of.
Yep. You're right.
And deliver this roaring mess of solo bass that, I have a terrible time dealing with it. It's just like, how in the world can I make this fit in and actually work? I joke around, but when you got a bass player who has 6 strings and is compelled to play beautiful riffs and all these great ideas and stuff, that's great. But hand them nice man a guitar and then hire someone who will actually play bass. Because bass is about groove, bass is about rhythm.
Right.
And you got too much going on down there, you just got mud. Because by the time you start layering in keys, by the time you start layering in all these other parts, percussion, group vocals, individual, whatever. By the time you start layering that stuff in, a busy bass part is almost indistinguishable. And then I'm faced with, what have I got to do to try and make this
put
bass
it all?
come
You got to decipher it all.
Yeah, and that's the limit to what I can do with what I do. I mean, it's in the arrangement. very often when people tell me that they really love a mix I did, I know what they're really saying is they really love the arrangement.
Wow.
Because when I get a mix, when I get a project and it's beautifully arranged, it just fits together. And I don't have to scratch my head and try and convince somebody they better turn something off and all this kind of business. It just fits together. It supports things. It puts a really good foundation in there, a great groove, supports the song, supports the singer, and then you start to talk about something that's going to reach a lot of people.
And you can kind of tell that most of your the clients that you work, and I know pretty much a lot of them kind of trust you to do the mixes on your own. Pretty much, I know you don't. How is your system of doing mixing now?
Well, I charge by the hour, and because my clients are buying those hours, they're welcome to be here the entire time if they want to. Most don't want to because it's pretty tedious sitting there watching some guy mix something. So,
right.
So it's up to them. But what I do with a lot of people, since many of my clients are not in Charlotte, actually most of my clients are not in Charlotte, is that they'll send me all the tracks. I'll guide them in terms of if they haven't finished recording, I may provide some technical guidance on how to get things maybe a little better and how to organize their project. Because the less time it takes, the less it's going to cost. The less time it takes, for me to mix it, the less expensive the process is. And I always want to be part of people's success, not part of the project that ran and broke. So, so anyway, once I get it in, I'll usually, whether they're here or not, I'll sort of get it to a point that I call 80%, where it sounds pretty good and it's all there. It's just a lot of busy work assembling a mix. I work in Nuendo, and most of my projects come in Pro Tools, so I basically reassemble all the audio into my own templates in Nuendo and go in there. So there's a lot of process involved there. And then once I get it to that point, I'll send them either a high quality MP3 or a WAV file, whatever they prefer, and get some feedback from them. And ideally, if the client can come to me and we'll finish the mix together, that's probably best and takes the least amount of time.
Exactly.
Although it also may take some travel expenses on their part, so some people don't. I've in the last couple of months, I've had clients in New Jersey and Cincinnati and Atlanta who all just strictly worked with me over the internet. I can't say I've honestly shaken the hand of more than one of those people. So it's funny to me to work that way. But anyway, I'm just saying that I don't really do anything on my own. This is all. It's not my record. I'm trying really, really hard to figure out where you're trying to go and help you get there. And if anything, my job is packaging.
Yes.
I don't create the content at all, but I do help sort of shape it up and present it so that and package it in a way so that hopefully it'll reach your listener in the best possible way. Because it goes back to the song. You got a song that's about something, and you want the listener to take that something in. So you get a singer who can sing it to where the listener can't help but pay attention. You get an arrangement that supports them and never gets in the way. You make good recordings. You wrap it up with a great mix and mastering, and then you reach them. That's the idea.
You know how to, as a mixing engineer, I know you don't think about it because your space is mixing, it's not mastering. But most
those are two very different skills.
Exactly.
I strongly recommend going to a specialist for mastering. It's just a completely different mindset. I mean, I've been making records obviously for decades and have worked with a number of mastering guys, but the best thing is to develop a relationship with a mastering guy who understands generally what you're trying to do and helps you accomplish it.
Yes.
That's sort of the concept of team. So these days, really the last probably 15 years, Dave Harris of Studio B Mastering has done nearly everything I've worked on. Dave does a great job. He works closely with people, and kind of like me, he's not making his record. He's trying to figure out what we're trying to do.
That's the truth.
And he does a great job of shaping low end and just a lot of skills there. So my stuff gets better, but Dave's in there. He's dealing with quarter decibels. He's dealing with these tiny increments of things that make a huge difference. Whereas a mixer, I'm dealing with 6 dB of this and 8 dB of that, and cranking knobs. So the things that make me good at mixing would make me really, really heavy-handed at mastering, which is not what you want. You want a guy who's kind of a watchmaker in that job,
Well, I think
So
both of you two over there, and it's Studio B. Y'all are a great team.
well, Studio B is Dave, and
Right.
it's actually two different companies.
Okay.
In fact, most of the time we don't even know what each other's doing. I just rent a couple of office spaces in his building, in the same building he's in, and that's where I've got my little mix set up. But no, yeah, we've certainly done a lot of records together, and frankly, in the recent years, the few that were directed either through a label or whatever to some other guy, I really regretted that Dave didn't do them. So I think my work sounds best after he's taken care of some things. So.
Hey, so you don't have that, and that actual environment, you don't really have the choice to choose who you want to work with.
No, I can recommend.
Okay.
And historically, mastering back in the 70s, 80s, and earlier involved some very expensive hardware and a lot of technical skill in terms of like cutting records. I mean, that's not something for amateurs. And around 1990, I started running into this thing as an engineer mixer, where some guy somewhere would buy a computer and he'd buy some software and say, "Hey, I'm a mastering guy,"
Mm-hmm.
and it was so bad the first parts of the 90s that the stuff was coming back, and it was horrible. And quickly I realized no one blames the mastering guy; they blame me. It's like, what was Mark smoking that day?
Right.
So in strictly in self-defense, I started really getting involved in trying to make sure I steered people to competent mastering. And knowing that in the end the product would be better and that my reputation would be better. So there's a lot of good reason for that. And it's just that nowadays places sell. You can go to Sweetwater and go to a Guitar Center or whatever, and they'll happily sell you some hardware and a computer and whatever, and it's the same tools that the rest of us use, but they can't sell you decades of experience.
That's
they
right.
Can't sell
That's
you
right.
the judgment that comes from having work done. In my case, couple thousand projects. In Dave's case, I mean, the guy works on 5 albums a week.
Mm.
So his sense of perspective, his sense of overview over what's going on out there is so far evolved from mine that I really, by the time I get to where it's going into mastering, I may have some specific conceptual things I'll lay on him, but I don't really want to talk nuts and bolts with him. If I'm even in there at all, I want to sit back and kind of dig what he's doing. If he has a question about something, I'll say
I've been in that experience, and it's awesome.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But okay, so I got to ask you some questions that probably annoying to you, but they are needed to be answered, and I need you to communicate with me. Okay, so there's a couple questions I'm gonna throw at you, and you take them and answer them the best way you can. If you don't want to answer, I'll edit this and that's it. But Pro Tools and Nuendo. Okay, your choice is Nuendo. What is the reason why you pick that instead of what many are using now as Pro Tools?
Well, I mean, I have Pro Tools also. I don't hate Pro Tools. I mean, if I object to anything about Pro Tools, it's nothing big. It's mostly, I think Pro Tools file management is just the worst and has always been the worst. And I don't understand why all these years later they haven't got it together. Everything else I use, like Nuendo, Cubase, you set up a project in a folder and it's got an audio files folder, and the audio never ever goes anywhere else.
Exactly.
Period. But in Pro Tools, man, you'll find audio files, all over the studio. Right. You'll find them in your coffee cup. It's just and so and they know it. So they had to come up with a process called Save Copy In that finds all this stuff.
That finds, compiles it all
and creates
together.
a new version of the file. So that's one of the things I talk to people about when they're about to send me a project is
save a copy.
I try to make sure they understand how to do that, because otherwise I'll have time scheduled. The client's paid a deposit for the time, and then I open it up. It's full of empty folders or empty blue boxes where the files ought to be. So that's a constant problem with Pro Tools. The other problem is sort of an attitude problem. Pro Tools doesn't play very well with other people. They sort of want you to think that the entire recording world is in Pro Tools, and I don't buy that. I mean, to me, all these workstations are basically fancy tape recorders, so, I just can't get into that. I mean, and my own little rig here, which I've put together just for my own use, it's too odd for anybody who want to rent it. It's really about half analog stuff and half digital stuff, and everything that's in here has a second reason to be here. I mean, it all does something that I use it for, but it contributes a sonic element that I like. So it's like the Manley compressor I use for the bus compressor. Man, there's a million compressors that would give me 2 dB of compression. It's just not like a big job, but there aren't any other ones that sound like that, so it contributes sonics to things that I can't get another way. Same with all the other pieces of gear in here. So anyway, with Pro Tools, it's just like they really sort of want to keep you inside their bubble there, and it sort of bothers them. And really the reason I didn't set this up originally with that is that Pro Tools, if you go for the Pro version, the real stuff, is really, really expensive. To get into Pro Tools, the real stuff, you've got to spend a bunch of dough. At the time, and again, it's different now, but at the time I was looking at putting something together, which was about 5 years ago, maybe, 5 or even 6 years ago. At that time, Pro Tools would still only work with their own interface boxes, and those things were expensive. I mean, it was like $5,000 for an 8-channel interface, which is just silly.
Ridiculous.
And they weren't especially good, frankly. And it had a lot of restrictions like that. So, I mean, Pro Tools has always been a hardware company in the past, and so you got the software for free if you bought their hardware.
Exactly.
Consequently, the hardware was quite expensive. Also, Pro Tools at that point, again, I'm talking 2008, 2009, was yet to improve a lot of elements that had sonically not been very good for a lot of years, like their mix bus design was just always kind of grindy sounding, which is one of the reasons people started mixing to outboard analog mixing networks of one sort or another. Meanwhile, Nuendo, which Steinberg, St. People's Cubase, and the whole mess is owned by Yamaha now. But anyway, they, going back into the 90s, had 32-bit floating buttons, and which sounded wonderfully more clear, and they had a lot of this little features in there that I guess Pro Tools wised up, because in Pro Tools 8, 9, and 10, they began to gather up and copy features heavily from Nuendo and from Logic, and it made it a better product. And again, I don't own stock in Nuendo. I mean, I just own some software, So I don't hate Pro Tools. I think Pro Tools has lots of good things going for it. It's just that until recently, when they made it possible to use other people's hardware, and they also began to.
That's a big reason too.
And in 10, when they went to 32-bit, that's a big sonic jump. If you're working in Pro Tools and not using 32-bit, you're crazy.
Yes.
It's just immediately better. So anyway, so at this point, if I were to do that again nowadays, I might seriously consider going to Pro Tools. But again, it's just like, I can argue for days about why I prefer Neve over SSL, but both are great pieces of gear.
It's what you do with them, like you said. It's what you do.
And I prefer MCI over Studer, but hey, they're both great tape recorders. So it's just a matter of preference at some point, and I wouldn't buy Nuendo because I use it necessarily. I just find that having had it in my system for about 6 years, I've got templates, I've got this and that. I'm on an upgrade path with it that makes it cheap to keep upgrading and that sort of thing. So
that's awesome. Okay, so next question would be why? Okay, now and maybe you can correct me. Please correct me if I'm wrong for saying this.
Count on it.
Early 2000 and I say late 90s, early 2000. It was a big, I guess, this whole loudness situation going on. I remember mixing some projects myself, and I would go to get them mastered, and it seems like they were crunched, and like there was this thing about, especially in gospel music, it's got to be the loudest it can be.
Yeah, everywhere. Well, I mean, it dates back many, many, many years.
Okay, thank you.
And it's always been kind of an issue. Back in the 60s, a lot of the record labels had their own studios and mastering, their own disc mastering. And at the time, I remember we used to cluck our tongues about Motown because for mastering 45s, there's certain reference levels and things. And some people would push the reference level by a couple of dB, but Motown would jack them at like 8 dB. And there was no way to play that 45 without it distorting. Plus, you know, if you remember the mixes in those days, the tambourine typically was louder than the snare. And so, you know, talk about a lot of high frequencies, overdrive, it would splatter. But on an AM radio station, which, you know, remember the high end on AM was like, you know, 5, 6K, something like that. It's pretty dull.
Dull, really dull.
That sort of splat would turn into bright.
Okay.
And the fact that it was louder, I mean, the DJs aren't sitting there watching meters. They had a big old rotary knob for each channel and a piece of tape that showed them where to turn it to, and they just, you know, they're busy trying to think of what to say. So they turn that knob to the same place each time, and the Motown records would bang the transmitter harder and be raunchier and cut through, and people hear it and buy it. So it was part of a marketing and packaging thing. But for most of us, the sound quality was really distasteful. Yeah, and I mean, not because of the kind of music. I mean, I was certainly making plenty of R&B records in Chicago, but just the sound quality, I thought, yuck. So more recently, because of the way with tape recording, generally you're looking at more of an averaging level. That's why you have the mechanical meters, and you're dealing with varying amounts of saturation that you control and that sort of thing. So level setting's a different ballgame. With digital, the resolution or clarity gets better and better and better the louder it gets until you hit the red line, then it goes immediately to horribleness.
Right.
And so what happened was in the 80s, you know, through the 80s into the 90s, we were, you know, first starting to make all digital records because we were suddenly setting all the levels from the entire process from, you know.
You have been listening to in-studio interviews at InspireMusicMediaRadio.com. That was mixing engineer Mark Williams. It was a great interview. We have more for you next week. That was only part 1. So share it with a friend. Tell everyone. Next week, same time, next Sunday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we will air part 2 of this great interview. For all you mixing engineers out there, you need to listen to this. It's a wealth of knowledge and wisdom from a man that has been doing it a very long time, and we salute him. Mark Williams, thank you for coming to the show, and we will have part 2 next Sunday. The air date will be April the 20th. That is Easter Sunday evening at 8:30 p.m. You've been listening to InspireMusicMediaRadio.com.